This hitchhiker I picked up was called Chris. He was a 66-year-old professional houseless man. A houseless is a word I prefer to use than homeless. It's when really you're in this lifestyle very much by choice, and that's what it felt like with Chris. He'd been living this life for over 30 years. He had a backpack, a pretty big backpack, and his aim really seemed to just be ramble around the countryside, to not work, but he also didn't draw benefits. I wasn't clear whether he kind of turned up and volunteered for work here and there, or if he was actually a beggar. I couldn't tell, but his outlook on life was really interesting, and I asked him a lot of questions about, what was in his bag and how he lived. And he didn't seem to be a traditional beggar, because he spent a lot of his time out in the countryside, whereas if he wanted to beg for as much money as possible, he'd want to be very visible in a city, I would have thought. So I asked him what happens if he ran out of food, ran out of money, and he had this phrase, "I struggle along." And what struck me about that was just the way in which he was just quite willing to accept that sometimes you do run out of food and out of money. And that was exactly what I was facing at the time with the £0 challenge. He was just so casual with it. He said, sometimes you do. And there he is 30 years later. So it seemed very much to prove a point. And it really made me think, meeting him. And it also made me think how already the £0 challenge was changing me. And that's because I'd picked up a hitchhiker for a start. I don't do that very often, but I did it both because I had more time, I wasn't working, and also because I was more aware of how little I had, because it seemed more finite since I'd decided to let my money run out, and that meant that I was more aware of how someone else could have less than me. Chris, with just his backpack, and there I am driving a van, and there he is needing a lift. He doesn't even have a van. And that changed me, and it meant that when I dropped him off, I said, "Oh, do you need anything?" And I was really surprised that I did that. And I'm not saying this to sort of say, "Oh, how generous am I?" It was just really interesting that even in that situation, I suddenly was like, "Oh, do you need anything? Is there anything you're missing? If I've got it, I'll give it to you." And I knew that I would, even if he asked for something that I did actually need, because I felt like I had the more resources to replace something like that, even with the challenge being on, than he probably did. And he asked me if I had something waterproof. I gave him that, and a bit of extra food, so I gave him that, and that was totally fine. But it really threw me to see that as I had less, I became more willing to give. I'm sure there's a point at which that runs out, but I've seen it quite often in travellers. You see someone, you think, "Oh God, they've got nowhere to sleep," and you say, "Do you want to just, I'll leave my van unlocked tonight." And I've had people say that to me as well, like, "Oh gosh, we're travelling and we meet each other," and they say, "Oh, if you've not got a coat, can I lend you a coat?" And you think, how do you know I'm going to bring it back? But that's just the way of things, and it feels like there's a sense of openness that comes with that world, which I was starting to delve into and really enjoy, and that I was seeing how there was a direct relationship between money and putting monetary value on things that was just such a direct blocker to generosity, and how even in starting the £0 challenge for a couple of weeks, I was moving away from that. Matthew Hammond, maths teacher and philosopher, always says, numbers aren't important, what you're counting is important. And I think I would add to that, the fact of counting it is important. Less counting and less eye on value and more eye on relationships and on the heart as well. More eye on the heart, more heart on the heart perhaps. So that was my experience of picking up a hitchhiker on the way to Oxford to see my dad.